Hello, and welcome to Coming Together, Coming Apart, Episode 10, Red China Rising. Wow, okay, where do I even begin to talk about the Chinese Civil War or Chinese Revolution or whatever you want to call the period of Chinese history from the end of the Qing Dynasty in 1912 to the proclamation of the People's Republic in 1949? There's 50 different places we could start this conversation. People have been living in the area we now know as China since the beginning of time, it seems. It's one of the oldest seats of human civilization. For much of its history, it has been ruled on and off by various imperial dynasties, the most recent of which was the Qing, who ruled from 1644 to 1912. That is the year that the last emperor of China abdicated and the Republic of China was born. This was all due to a revolution, the Xinhai Revolution of 1911, that was the result of years of foreign domination, administrative incompetence, and imperial apathy. Before we go any further, I guess I should put out a big disclaimer. I want you to know I am far from an expert on China. I have taken a grand total of one university course on the country, and that dealt primarily with modern Chinese foreign policy. So today is going to be an overview and nothing more. Over the next 30 minutes or so, I am going to do my best to give you some insight into the events that shaped the two Chinas as we will see them during the Korean War. I cannot stress enough that this is nowhere near enough time to fully do this topic justice. The Chinese Revolution deserves a full series, and all I really want to do is scratch the surface in ways that explain why the Communists won the Civil War in 1949, why Mao was the one who led the Communists to victory, and why this flipped the geopolitical situation in post-World War II East Asia on its head. That means I am going to skip over some things that other, much smarter people would say are important to the course and conduct of the Revolution and Civil War. I preemptively will agree with them, and look forward to the day when I feel confident enough to cover this massively important conflict properly. I'm probably also going to mispronounce many things today. Please know that I've tried really hard to get them as right as I can, but even then, I apologize in advance. To give some overview of today's episode, I've split the Chinese Revolution into 4 phases. They all hinge around 1934. This was the year of the Long March, the retreat of the Communists to a stronghold of last resort at Yan'an, and it is the year that marked a distinct turning point in the course of one of the seminal conflicts of the last quarter millennium. As we'll see, the Long March is when Mao takes control of the Communist Party of China, and it is from this year-long retreat that Mao gained key experiences that would shape his decisions and the actions of the CPC during the later stages of the Civil War and during the Korean War. For today's episode, I am mostly relying on 5 books: Jonathan Spence's biography of Mao, and his overview of the entire revolution from 1895 to 1980, The Gate of Heavenly Peace, Paul Thomas Chamberlain's The Cold War's Killing Fields, Diana Larry's China Civil War, A Social History, and Suzanne Pepper's Civil War in China, The Political Struggle. These last 2 books deal specifically with the period from the end of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1945 to the end of the Civil War in 1949, and are really good reads if you're interested in learning more of the specific details of the non-military aspects of the last stage of this conflict. There are 3 reasons I have split the revolution and war into 4 phases. 1, I didn't want to spend a whole lot of time speaking on the entire conflict because frankly it does not all pertain to the Korean War directly. And if it does pertain to the Korean War, it is really only because it directly affects the development of communism in East Asia. 2, each of the phases are distinctly separated by a large and important event. The Kuomintang's turn against the communists in 1927, the Long March of 1934 and 1935, or the end of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1945. Third, these phases also correspond with Mao Zedong's development as both a military leader and a political theorist, which I think is an important part of the Civil War, not because I think Mao single-handedly diverted the flow of history, but because he is just one side of a very important coin. On the other is his ideological enemy, Chiang Kai-shek. Both were strong authoritarians with all the progress and oppression that entails. They really are not as different as some people want them to be. I do not buy into the great man theory of history. That said, there are some figures who stand taller than others, and, had they not been in the right place at the right time, events would have transpired quite differently. Mao Zedong is one of those figures. This was not always going to be the case, though. I hesitate to call Mao's beginnings humble, as that's a bit too fawning for my liking. Semi-impoverished is a better description. There is no neat trajectory of Mao's life and career that gives him a clean path to his position as the head of Asian communism in 1949. It was evident at an early age that Mao wanted to be something different than the millions of other young Chinese men born into an age of revolution, that he wanted to be someone different than what was written in his stars. Most importantly, he was smart, he was hardworking, and he had a way with people both at a personal level and as an orator. These personal characteristics enabled him to take advantage of his circumstances better than most. The Chinese Revolution can take its earliest reasonable beginnings back to the end of the Cheng Empire in 1912. Again, lots of different reasons this happened in 1912, but it mostly came down to a potent mix of peasant dissatisfaction with what the Qing were doing for them, an intellectual awakening among middle-class Chinese, especially those who had studied in foreign universities, and a failure to implement necessary reforms to modernize the country into the 20th century. The Shantang Emperor's abdication in 1912 threw the country into chaos. General Yuan Shikai tried to impose order for a bit as leader of the Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, but after his death in 1916, warlords carved up the countryside among themselves for the next 12 years. These warlords built sizable armies and constantly fought each other, trying to gain the upper hand over their rivals. Alliances were broken much easier than they were made. It was, quite generally speaking, a time of political, social, and economic chaos in China. But it is specifically chaotic times that allow for a person to make the greatest changes in their life. And that is exactly what Mao Zedong did. Mao was born the son of peasants in Hunan province in southern China, and he decided as a child that he did not just want to be another peasant. He didn't have any grand plans for his life, he just knew he needed to be somewhere else. Actually, I think that feeling of restlessness would be a defining trait of Mao throughout his life, both intellectually and geographically. He had some schooling in his youth and appears to have been a voracious reader of anything translated into Chinese, and, when it was founded in 1921, he joined the Communist Party of China, the CPC. This was the first communist party in East Asia and was set up with assistance from the Soviet Union's Comintern. Mao would return to the city of Changsha in Hunan thereafter to set up a local branch of the party. He was actually pretty good at this, growing the party's footprint in the area and learning the ropes of political organizing. In 1925, the Communists joined the Kuomintang, the KMT, and a united front party, the first major attempt to reunify China and break the control of the warlords. Mao was originally against such an alliance, and his fears proved real with the breakup of the United Front in 1927. The betrayal of the CPC by the KMT proved to Mao and his fellow communists that a truly united front with the Kuomintang was not possible, as its reactionary and counter-revolutionary elements were too strong within the party, exemplified by the KMT leader, Chiang Kai-shek. It totally destroyed the future prospects for cooperation between the two parties. The Communists, faced with extermination through exceptional repression, split and hid among the rural countryside and mountainous wilderness until something about their situation changed. That time would not arrive until 1934. By that time, the CPC was in dire straits. You just can't get money for nothing, and Mao's walk of life had taken him from the mountainous fringe of Hunan to the border of Jiangxi and Fujian provinces, east of Hunan. It is here that the CPC formed the Jiangxi Soviet. This base allowed the CPC to regroup and take stock of their situation. It also provided Chiang Kai-shek the perfect opportunity to deliver the final blow against what he saw, quite wrongly, as his greatest enemy. The nationalist armies attempted to defeat the communists at Shaanxi multiple times over the next 5 years. It was not until October 1934 that their single-minded focus on the communists in Shaanxi was successful, and the CPC leadership, notably excluding Mao from the planning process, decided to retreat from Shaanxi. Thus began the infamous Long March. I think Jonathan Spence both accurately describes the Long March and takes a dig at what happens to history once historians and propagandists get their hands on it in his biography of Mao, writing, quote, "The Long March, later presented as a great achievement in communist history, was a nightmare of death and pain while it was in progress," end quote. This was a massive column of people moving with no predetermined direction except to get away from KMT forces and the death they wrought. In Shunyi, a city in south-central China, the communists took a breather, and, during a leadership meeting in January of 1935, they decided that a new path was needed. Mao was formally promoted into a leadership position, and the communists decided they needed to head north. After 10 more months of torturous marching through some of the harshest terrain in China, and with significantly diminished numbers, the communists arrived in Yan'an. It would be a most fortunate home for Mao. A quick aside, if you already know anything about the history of the Long Revolution, you probably know that there are other places I could have chosen for this middle division. The reason I chose the CPC's arrival in Yan'an is simply because the communists won. I mean, this is pretty big H history here, so there's no point in building up any tension. The communists win, which kind of naturally skews any discussion of the conflict towards the group that many thought of as underdogs up until 1949. While the split of 1927 and the surrender of Japan in 1945 would probably stay the same if I took a view more from the nationalist stance, the kidnapping of Cheng in 1936 or the Japanese invasion of 1937 were probably more important events in a nationalist-skewed discussion of the conflict. But because I want to specifically talk about the communists and Mao, Yan'an becomes a massively important place. In Yan'an, the CPC found a place they could truly call a home, and from which they could conserve their strength to fight the type of war they wanted to fight, and not a war dictated to them by their enemy. In Yan'an, Mao found a place where he could supercharge his ideological development and put his theories on communism into practice. He had had some success in previous communes with practical communism, but things really take off for him in Yan'an. While the Long March had given Mao the opportunity to ascend into the party leadership, Yan'an gave him the opportunity to cement himself as an ideological superstar of the party. It is in Yan'an that Mao received news of the kidnapping of Chiang Kai-shek in nearby Cheyenne in late 1936, and of the Marco Polo Bridge incident of mid-1937 that kicked off the Second Sino-Japanese War. Both of these events pushed the KMT and CPC to form a new united front against the Japanese threat. Both went into this alliance begrudgingly. This was a true blessing for the communists, though, who were weakened by the Long March and still desperate for a chance to prove their worth to the people they contended to represent. By solidifying their control in Yan'an, the CPC could put in place land reforms to both see how things went and to show that they were serious about materially improving the lives of peasants. After the initial Japanese gains driving south out of Manchuria and west from the coast, the war ground into a stalemate. Nationalist forces took the brunt of the violence. Well, your average Chinese took the brunt of the violence, but in factional terms, the nationalists took the brunt of the violence. While nationalists fought a much more traditional style of war against the Japanese, the communists excelled at setting up cells of guerrillas behind Japanese lines of control. This also allowed Mao to build his military theory of guerrilla warfare, wherein small groups lure enemies deep into communist territory where they are isolated, surrounded, and then destroyed by an overwhelming and impassioned guerrilla force. These cells kept Japanese attention away from Yan'an and allowed Mao and his comrades to live a relatively comfortable life, or at least as comfortable as one can live in a cave. Yan'an was surrounded by a system of caves that were cheap to construct, easy to defend, and well suited to the climate of the region. While later propagandists would point to how Mao's living in a cave proved just how much a man of the people he was, it was more a matter of circumstance. It really was the best option for what Mao needed at the time. Mao was also fortunate to meet the young intellectual Chen Bodat in Yan'an. Chen was a former university lecturer and was wicked smart with communist theory. Between a dense schedule of academic reading on economics, politics, and philosophy, and his relationship with Chen, Mao's ideological strengths flourished in Yan'an. His authoritarian tendencies also flourished in Yan'an. As Spence writes it, Mao moved from living the simple life because he had to choosing to live the simple life, to boasting about living the simple life, to forcing others to live the simple life with him. This helped Mao keep control of those below him and deflect criticisms of those who dared challenge him. Before the end of the War of Resistance against Japan, Mao would successfully defend himself from internal dissent within the CPC, fully ensuring his power over what the party would become after Japan's defeat. The split of the Second United Front was not a certain thing after the surrender of Japan in August 1945. I mean, sure, they no longer had their common enemy, but certainly the KMT and CPC could set aside their differences and their pasts to work together towards a brighter future for China. Well, yes, but actually no. The discord between the two never really ended with the fight against the Japanese. Skirmishes and small conflicts between communists and nationalists still occurred between 1937 and 1945. Both sides were hoping that the Japanese would leave them alone and focus on the other. Both tried to infiltrate the administrative apparatus of the other to learn more information that could assist them in the inevitable civil war. And both complained that the other was using the United Front only to further their own goals and not to push the Japanese invaders out of China. Basically, the United Front was never built to last, and was held together with a very light coating of papier-mâché. The last chance to keep the United Front together came with the arrival of American General George Marshall in late 1945, who was mandated to keep negotiations between Mao and Cheng alive. The Americans thought the negotiations were just on life support and could be re-energized, but in fact both the KMT and CPC were deep into their preparations for war. When the Soviets invaded Manchuria in August 1945, the Chinese Communists moved as fast as they could to fight alongside their northern comrades. For their troubles, the Soviets gave them captured Japanese arms and equipment, drastically improving their material strength. The next 4 years of conflict gave the soldiers of the Chinese Red Army valuable experience that would be very handy in the mountains of Korea. Mao's military strategies of fighting only when victory was assured allowed the Communists to slowly rack up victory after victory. That's not to say that the entire reason for their success was because of Mao's genius. Mao surrounded himself with smart and capable leaders who were willing to take risks and who were both ideologically and personally loyal to Mao. The CPC also really could not have picked a better opponent than the Kuomintang. The KMT was corrupt, inefficient, and did not have any desire to change itself. The nationalists actively lost the war, just as much as the communists actively won. From Suzanne Pepper, quote, "While various sectors of the public in effect made reform the condition for cooperating with the KMT demanded unconditional support from them, offering little in return but lip service to principles that were never realized in practice." End quote. The KMT could have won the war if Cheng wasn't so stubborn, if it was able to instill any sense of purpose in its troops, if its strategists were more creative in what it takes to actually be a guerrilla movement, and if it made any meaningful effort to reform itself to prove its worth in the eyes of the people. On the flip side, the communists were masterful at identifying the weaknesses of their enemy and fighting the war their way, and not their enemy's way. The communists dictated to the KMT what the war was going to be like, and were better able at identifying the best ways to take advantage of the KMT's weak points. They also correctly recognized that, although military action could defeat the nationalists, they needed to follow it up with meaningful political and economic change to gain and keep the support of those elements that could inhibit their victory. The Chinese Civil War ended much the same way you fall asleep, very slowly, then all at once. In the beginning of the war, in late 1946, the KMT appeared to be successful. But in almost every battle they won, the communists kept the bulk of their forces. In almost every battle they lost, the KMT lost a lot of men and material. Like the Japanese before them, the nationalists maintained control of China's cities for the first couple years of the war, but the communist guerrillas controlled much of the countryside with their main base of support among rural peasants. And that's a real problem when most of your economy is based on agriculture. Lin Biao's massive offensive in early 1947 brought most of Manchuria under communist control and gave the CPC the largest base of support it had ever had. This operation allowed the CPC to move from a defensive war to an offensive war. From Manchuria, the communists consolidated and expanded their control over northern China through the end of 1948, culminating in the capture of Beijing in January of 1949. From Beijing, the communists could transition from guerrilla warfare to total war against KMT forces. At this point, though, KMT forces were thoroughly demoralized and depleted. New forces were not mentally into the fight and were poorly trained, if trained at all. CPC forces, on the other hand, were mostly battle-hardened and, because of the extensive political education, were fully on board with their purpose. Even nationalist commanders readily jumped over to the communist camp if things got tough, like Fu Zhouyi, the general in charge of the defense of Beijing. Fu negotiated a place for himself and his army in the communist ranks before giving the communists the ancient seat of imperial sovereignty, and his men were totally on board with that. On April 20th, communist forces crossed the Yangtze River, the last major natural barrier to total control of the Chinese mainland, and captured the nationalist capital of Nanjing a few days later. Before the capture of their capital, though, the nationalists had already begun fleeing to the island of Taiwan. Cheng himself resigned from the presidency, although he would step back into power not even a year later. In May, Shanghai fell to the communists with little resistance, a reality far from the cries of making it a second Stalingrad that came from nationalist commanders in the city. With their largest cities captured, having fled off the mainland, and with the communists moving further southward, the nationalists had well and truly lost the war. And when I say that they fled the mainland, though, I really mean that those that fled to Taiwan were mostly the KMT leadership and those with big reasons to fear communist rule. Many people decided to stay behind. This is as much an indictment of the failure of the KMT to build popular support than it was of the communists to win over the average person. In the least, most people figured that the communists could not possibly be worse than the nationalists. A lot of this information about what the communists were offering came from rumors, because the KMT did not allow any Chinese-language newspapers to print accurate information. The only allowable content was propaganda, so rumors satiated the people's hunger for information. That was disastrous for the KMT's credibility once communists took over an area and proved the propaganda mostly wrong. On October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong stood in front of the Tiananmen Gate of the Forbidden Palace in Beijing, long a symbol of imperial power, and proclaimed the People's Republic of China. In a stroke, the largest country in the world turned red. In the United States, this was unthinkable. American leaders knew the KMT was weakened, but they did not expect such a rapid collapse. They had spent millions of dollars on aid money and equipment to help keep the KMT's war effort going, and it was mostly all for naught. Truman, as a Democrat, now faced calls from his opponents in the Republican Party to take a harder stance against communism. Remember, this is happening at the same time that containment is becoming the leading light of American foreign policy. To Republicans, Truman had lost China, and if military force wasn't on the table, more countries would fall to communism. This domestic pressure would shape the American response to the next major crisis of communist expansion in Korea, not even a year later. The United States would not recognize the People's Republic until the 1970s, normalizing relations in 1979 with the transfer of the U.S. Embassy from Taipei in Taiwan to Beijing. The Soviet response is much more interesting. Throughout the Civil War, the Soviets did not really support the CPC as fully as they could. Even though the Red Army provided captured Japanese material to the CPC, they did not do much else. Stalin was playing both sides of the war to ensure that, no matter who won, the Soviets would have a place in China. Stalin did not believe that the CPC could win until the Civil War began to lean towards the communists, and only then did the Soviets try to play catch-up with everything they logically should have been doing all along. And even then, it's not enough. By October 1949, Mao can easily say he is one of only two communist leaders that did not rely on the Soviet Union to take power, the other being Yugoslavia's Tito. Mao would often consult with Stalin on the best thing to do internationally, but at the end of the day, he did not have to fully listen to Moscow if it wasn't in his best interests. This gave Stalin some anxiety about how to interact with a country that was a necessary part of the geographic fence maintaining Soviet security, but also doesn't necessarily require Soviet approval for everything. The end of the Chinese Civil War does change things for other East Asian communists. As we'll see next week, after the communist victory in 1949, Stalin becomes much more open to Kim's pleas for aid in attacking South. Elsewhere, Stalin respected the new status quo in East Asia for the first couple years, even so much as to ensure the Communist Party of the Soviet Union had no formal ties to the Japanese Communist Party, which was trying to non-violently resist the American occupation of Japan. It was not until 1949 that those ties were established with the JCP, which was a reflection of the higher level of confidence the Soviets now had in East Asian communists with the end of the Chinese Civil War. In 1945, 1946, and 1947, Stalin wanted to maintain the principles of international relations agreed to in Yalta towards the end of World War II. After the breakdown of relations in Korea, the breakdown of relations in Germany, and the communist victory in China, all bets were off. The Cold War was on, 100%, and all it needed to turn hot was a single spark. This was just a brief overview of the Chinese Revolution and Civil War. I barely talked about land reform. I barely talked about all of the different political things that drove the conflict from beginning to end. And I barely talked about many of the social changes that have reshaped and were shaped by Chinese culture before, during, and after the revolution. For now, though, this pretty much brings everything into a place where, within the next couple weeks, we can finally witness the invasion of one Korea by the other. Before we end this week's discussion of the Chinese Civil War, though, I just want to clarify something from last week's episode. When I said that those policies caused cracks in the Anglo-American-Soviet relationship, I meant the policies of all parties involved. One thing I want to make very clear from this week and last week is that there were no passive participants in the Cold War. Some were along for the ride, but everyone made choices that deepened and widened the gaps, especially the Soviets and the Americans. And that's where we'll leave our discussion for now, with a new China taking the reins from a slightly less new China. Next week, we will return to the Korean Peninsula to set the final stage for invasion. If you're able, I would be very grateful if you left a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, if leaving reviews is possible there. Whether it's 1 star or 5 stars, the fastest way for me to grow as a podcaster is to get your honest feedback. If there's something specific you'd like to talk about, you can submit a message to me through the contact page on the website. You can also send me an email at ctcapodcast@gmail.com. If you're on social media, you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as @ctcapodcast. If you're not on social media, you can find more information, including the references for today's episode and the contact page, at ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. That's ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. We release new episodes every Tuesday. Please be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. I am Trevor Owens, and this is Coming Together, Coming Apart. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have an enjoyable week.